In this episode, we're visiting the Rhineland. We'll talk with German brewer Sebastian Sauer from Freigeist Bierkultur. This free spirit is making unconventional beer in a very conventional beer country. He pulls from brewing's forgotten past while keeping his eyes firmly focused on the future. Welcome to No Pants During the Pandemic. Hi, I'm Kevin Brooks, and this is No Pants During the Pandemic. Today I'm speaking with the brains behind Freigeist Bierkultur, Sebastian Sauer. He's a little shy, so we'll have to see if we can coax him out of his shell. Hey Sebastian, how you doing today?
I'm doing good. How are you, Kevin?
I'm doing okay. Now for people who aren't familiar with you, why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Sure. My name is Sebastian, and I was born in the border triangle area of Germany, like Netherlands and Belgium border are very close to where I'm from.
So I guess living in Germany and being so close to those other great beer countries is what got you into beer?
Yeah, that was just interested in beer, but also interested in production of food and drinks and so on, and the culture and history about it. And obviously, Germany is a very important beer country and had in the past way more styles than nowadays. Also, way more regionality in beer. And so that was a lot of that which was interesting and intriguing me.
What made you go from being a beer fan to actually starting Freigeist?
It was different reasons. One of the reasons was that the last good Berliner Weisse was discontinued. The company got taken over and they stopped to produce the good Berliner Weisse. And so at that time it was very, very difficult to find sour beer, especially good sour beer in Germany. And so that was one of the things where I said, okay, if everybody stops, then I want to start.
And when did you start it?
I started Freigeist with a friend of mine in 2009. We started to brew in his brew pub in Cologne to make the first batches. As I said, it was in a brew pub, so it was a smaller capacity and no professional packaging equipment. So we kind of had to expand pretty soon and go to different places to actually get bigger capacities brewed. And that's how the whole gypsy idea came around.
And you came right out of the gate brewing a sour beer.
The very first commercial beer we brewed was called Abraxas, and it's a recreation of a Lichtenhainer, which is a beer style from Thuringia, which is pretty much in the middle of Germany. And it's a sour smoked wheat beer and died out around the First World War. When coming across the style, I was very intrigued and I wanted just to recreate it.
This is my favorite thing about Freigeist. You take these old styles and bring them back to life. But why do it?
I love history, so I'm just always have been interested in things which were around in the past. Like what was the place about where I'm sitting right now, like hundreds of years ago or something. And so I've always just looked a lot into historical stuff, and that's definitely a big hobby of mine.
But you're not trying to make an exact copy of these beers.
I'm not trying to tell anyone, okay, taking the example of Abraxas, this is the beer style would taste exactly like this in 1860. That would be totally wrong because at the time you had obviously different quality of ingredients, worse qualities than obviously nowadays, or different techniques and so on. So the result was very different and not very stable. So this would be a more questionable beer we would produce, and for us, it's obviously the idea to make very good beer, and so that's why we take the base idea of the style and put it in a fictional time machine and saying, okay, all these styles, for example, had a way increase the attenuation. In the former times, for example, because of the quality of malt, it wasn't possible to get so much sugar, for example, out of the malt. There was still a lot of starch and so on left. And then there's like a lot of the sugar wouldn't ferment because the yeast weren't that clean and that proper. And so it ended up to be not completely fermented through, and you couldn't really package it and it wouldn't last very long. You would have that same situation as you like go to some farmhouse breweries in like Lithuania, for example, where the beer tastes now like this and tomorrow tastes very different, and 2 days later maybe already really bad, and this has been around for quite some time to have these qualities, and that is like not very desirable to do, to actually have that available and trying to show it to the world. And that's why we pretty much modernized the recipes, but still in the original true styles according to the descriptions how they were, but just as I said, with like modern aspects, so that you could imagine that the beer might taste like this if it would have survived through the whole history.
Besides Abraxas, why don't you give me a few examples of the beers you brought back?
One of them would be also like Geisterzug, to talk about Gose, for example, before everybody else was making it. I mean, this is like based on an old 19th century recipe. We're making a lot of cool ship beers, icebox, champagne beers, which most of the time you can only find certain types. What we make more the unusual, irregular stuff, and Adam beer and so on. Also, the one we made with Ritterguts with Thilo on the 500th anniversary of the purity law. Thilo and me teamed up to make a beer, but obviously not according to the purity law. And so we made a recipe from a Gose, from the original Gose city called Goslar. In Goslar, or just outside of Goslar, there's a little creek called Gose. That's where the name of the beer style is from. And that recipe, for example, it was featuring coriander and salt, but also cinnamon and spruce twigs and vermouth, like wormwood. And so we pretty much used that for the beer style as well. But it was the very first beer we did on our cool ship. So we actually made the wort in the brewery, and then we transferred it to the cool ship and did the main fermentation on the cool ship, compared to what a lot of like the lambic brewers would do, that they just inoculate overnight, and after the fermentation we would transfer it into wooden barrels, and then we would do a heavy barrel aging process. So we kept the beer for more than 3 years in wooden barrels before we actually released it.
And what was it like?
It showed through these different spicing a very complete different unknown for Gose character, which totally worked really nice as well. Just put a different light on to the style of Gose as well, because there was like different areas where Gose was made, and there was always a lot of variation in between the places as well. So they changed the grain bills, for example. Some of the styles would be more wheat malt driven, or some would be having more barley malt parts. Different spices were used, and so that's how a lot of these styles originate from pretty much the same tree.
How do you research these recipes and the variations in these old styles?
There's a lot of books from the past. I mean, obviously a lot has also been destroyed through 2 world wars, but there's still a lot of like information can be found in archives, and it depends on what kind of time you're looking for and what kind of style you're interested in. But there's like a lot of very scientific information was around already in the 19th century, that like more and more people would get more precise with process. And in a lot of times in the references and books, you find other books, and then you can try to find these books as well.
Are there any other old recipes or styles that you're looking to bring back?
Yes, for sure. I mean, there's always certain ones which are interesting. I would have loved to actually even would have focused more on this and making more different styles, but I'm in the little bit of an uncomfortable situation that I also need to sell what I'm brewing. So I pretty much need to have a little bit of a plan up front where to sell it. For example, the most recent recreation of a style I made was a Cottbusser, which is like completely not made in Europe at all. So it's a beer style which you can find some descriptions from the 19th century, and was like a rather hoppy beer. I mean, not talking about American IPA standards, but like historical German 19th century standards, with oat and honey, and looking for some other ones as well. But again, it's necessary to sell it, and most people, especially at that time, want hazy IPAs and certain other very fashionable beers. And it's a little bit sad that the times of diversity where I came into craft beer, it was all about like tasting a lot of different type of beers, and every type of beer had its specific time and place. And nowadays it's like it's even more than in those days, that huge craze for kind of like always the same beers among craft brewers is very difficult to find. Mild, bitter, um, Weizenbock, quadruple, Belgian IPA, even like black IPAs and amber ales and so on. So it's like all these styles which are around and definitely have something nice about them. It's not really made because everybody knows as soon as you brew them, you will have a hard time to actually sell it off. And historical beers, it's definitely not easier to do that, except it would fall into the categories of like gozo or something, which became obviously very popular, but it's way easier to produce other type of beers.
What does Freigeist actually mean, and how does it reflect what you do?
Freigeist means free spirit in German, but at the same time, Geist also means ghost. That's why you can see in this logo that there's like ghost around. But Freigeist as a compound word means free spirit, and the idea that I'm making beers which are very unconventional in a very conventional beer country,
And how do you do that?
using certain ingredients, using certain techniques, which in Germany are unheard of. I kind of like to question things and like to use certain things if they bring a good result out of it, and that's what I focus on, and not trying to just do things because they've always been done like this.
So one of the things you question is the purity law.
That's that question is always coming up.
It's a gimme, I'm sorry.
Can't go around it, I guess.
Nope.
I just feel sometimes like an LP, which is like running around the whole time.
Sorry to be predictable.
No voice. I can handle it. No, with the purity law, I mean, you have to consider that Germany is a federal country, similar to the US. So we are not that centralized compared to like France, for example. So the purity law came up, the one we talk about in 1560, but there have been a lot of other purity laws in different areas as well. The one in from 1516 was in Ingolstadt, just north of Munich, and was like for that area, it was valid. But then a few decades later, it was pretty much taken away again, because then it was allowed to use certain spices like caraway and bay leaves as well. But it was never a law for the whole country of Germany, which we know nowadays, because Germany didn't exist the way it exists now. It's a rather young country. Before, it was a lot of different monarchies and different regions, which were never, as I said, very centralized.
I don't think most Americans realize that Germany is a younger country than the United States. So how did this become a federal law?
So within the centralization process, which came more in speed in the 19th century, it was pretty much the purity law came up again in Bavaria, and they thought, oh, it's actually good. So the 2000 states actually were the first ones to kind of take it in as a law again. But even at that point, it was still not a law outside of the states. We have 16 states. So I said two took it, and then at the very beginning of the 20th century, in 1906, they actually made it as a condition for further uniting process, that the purity law should be the law inside of the whole country. And since then, we have this law situation which says, okay, you can only use water, malt, hops, and yeast. There's like certain different rules about it as well. Especially, we don't have a law which is called purity law. Differently, it's called Vorläufiges Biersteuergesetz. So it's kind of like a little bit more of a myth around it, because the original law says it's water, barley, and hops, but wheat beer, for example, is nowadays considered to be according to the purity law as well. Then it says barley, not barley malt, and barley is, for example, in bottom fermented beers is not allowed to get used, but barley malt is. So there's a lot of things which got modernized in this way, and it's kind of like as a way to view it. But again, in our area and anywhere outside of these two areas, has never been the case. And so if you look into the old historical recipes from our areas, they totally contained a lot of different spices and fruits and so on, like in other countries as well. And yeah, we pretty much lost that whole history. And I mean, Goza would be obviously probably the most popular or most famous example of a German beer style, which is not according to the purity law. And we had a lot of these styles. And so afterwards, you could only brew them if you got a permission from your local authorities to actually do so. And that's why we still pretty much deal with that situation, and which is kind of like a pain in the ass, because every time we run into or could run into certain problems if people would make a fuss about it.
When you started Freigeist, there weren't really any what we would call craft brewers in Germany, but I'd consider you one of them.
This is always very difficult to categorize this. What is obviously craft beer and who is a craft brewer and so on. It's pretty tough to describe this, because we have a lot of very old but also very small breweries. So when the terminology of craft came up, a lot of them said, oh, like in Franconia, for example, hey, we're brewing craft beer since 500 years. From the way I would define things, a different mindset. I mean, for me, first of all, craft beer is neither good nor bad. It's just more like a little bit of a question of mindset, and a certain tendency of like experimenting more and trying new things, and just like kind of like pushing the limits in this way. That's kind of like how I understood craft beer.
I think my problem with the craft term is that, like you said, it's neither good nor bad. It's an American centric term that was made to differentiate the beers that were made by these new small independent brewers who were using better quality ingredients and processes from what the industrial brewers were doing. And the term works for the most part in the United States.
Yeah.
But as soon as you go to Europe, to places like Germany and England, it starts to fall apart really quickly, because you have these traditional brewers who are still making beers with the ingredients and processes that modern craft brewers use. Before you use the term a different mindset, but that's something that's intangible, when you want to call somebody craft. So how do you apply it? I mean, it doesn't really mean anything there.
But in the advertisement term,
Yeah, and then the term could be applied to brewers who most definitely are not craft.
according um, to the Brewers Association guidelines, even Warsteiner could be considered craft beer. So it's like super messy here to explain to people what it's about, because as soon as someone tries to look into the original guidelines, it's kind of like total nonsense for us. It's not applying, and this is where the older breweries in Germany don't really fit into that category. But obviously, there's like also certain breweries where it's kind of like right on the edge. Like, I mean, Schlenkerla would be like nowadays, as a modern brewery, would be definitely in the category of a craft beer brewery. So like making these type of beers, so they kind of like always went against the grain. But yeah, it's kind of difficult. But like as a modern craft beer brewery, I think there was none which was specifically trying to go in this direction. So I would guess Freigeist was the first one.
What was the reaction to your unconventional beers in Germany when you first opened?
As I said, our first beer was Lichtenhainer, which is like even nowadays very challenging for most beer drinkers. So it would have been way easier, and from a commercial point of view, way more smart to do like a pale ale or an IPA to start with that. Even that would have been quite challenging, but way easier to access and quite easier accessible for people and for beer drinkers in Germany. But this was not the way I was interested in going, because I was like more or less kind of like already a bit bored by the whole IPA subject. there's been so many around until 2000, before 2009. So there wasn't that much new stuff you could have given to it to add something completely different. And from my point, it was more interesting to really kind of come up with a German edition of craft beer, just like the mindset of a German brewery. And so that was kind of like missing in this world at that point.
Cool.
Yeah, it's kind of weird to look back at it, because it's kind of like seems so weird, you know. It's like, oh yeah, I did that 11 years ago.
Wait till you get to my age. But seriously, I mean, it must have been really slow going.
Yeah, we made Lichtenhainer. Then the second beer we made was a rye imperial stout. Then we had some alt beer and so on. And I mean, the Lichtenhainer was really tough. I mean, a lot of people who like smoke beer, you know, German people who go to Schlenkerla and so on, to Bamberg to drink it, most of them don't like sour beer. Then you have some people, especially closer to the border, where it's like they have a certain acceptance of sour beer, but then they don't like smoke beer, you know. So it's like you're pretty much, even in the niche, you're kind of like kicking everybody in the face of like with like the combination of both. So it was pretty tough to offer to people, and nearly nobody got it and was like understanding of it. And so it kind of like got first more reputation in other countries than in Germany. Like even nowadays, it's like I'm doing a lot of online tastings, and just like with people drinking this for the first time and now starting to actually liking it. But it was such a long way, or is still on the way, of like people accepting sour beer, for example. And especially we're talking about lactic sour beers, not like complex lambic stuff, but it's just like it's such a long way for people in Germany to learn about taste and stuff like this. And so it's kind of tough.
Even your Kolsch wasn't quite what people were expecting, right?
Yeah, but the unfiltered Courage, that's like also very like Cologne driven. I mean, Lichtenhainer, if you explain this, is like that's like in former East Germany and stuff, you know. So people have seriously no connection with that area, with that style. They've never heard about this. They don't have anything to do with these taste components. Unfiltered Courage, I mean, it's just an unfiltered version of the city's drink. It's a little bit more challenging, but people quickly get a taste for it. And if you go just outside of Cologne, in the western suburbs, there's actually two breweries which used to be around. And it was like more common to drink unfiltered Kölsch than filtered Kölsch. Even filtered Kölsch was available as well. Nearly all the breweries used to make this type of version as well, just a few decades ago, but there were still sometimes older people which would come up to you and would just like tell you their story of like how they remember that they were drinking it in the past.
As a history junkie, you must have really loved that.
Oh yeah.
You mentioned earlier that you're a gypsy brewer, so where is most of your beer made?
There is one brewery I work with since 8 years. It's called Vormann Brauerei. And that's like half an hour away from Dortmund, which used to be the biggest brewing city in whole Europe. Very heavy beer drinking area as well. And Vormann is a very little countryside brewery, and it's kind of like a brewery which normally nowadays doesn't exist anymore. You know, like in this size. There has been the time after Second World War where like even like all the smaller breweries would just like grow so insanely over the time. You think of like Warsteiner and Krombacher and all of these places which weren't that big breweries around Second World War. They were just like very like small size, and but all of the breweries grew so much because there was like more and more um, drinking going on and so on. Foreman has always stayed small, and all the big ones competed at some level against each other, and most of them lost this game. And we obviously know the winners, which are still around. And it's like in this whole called Ruhr area, Ruhrgebiet in German, there's like millions and millions of people, like pretty much combining all the like cities like Dortmund and Essen and Bochum and Duisburg, and all quite big cities, and one of the most populous areas in Europe. And they used to have a crazy amount of breweries, especially in the high days of steelworking and mining and so on. It's like very, very industrial area. And in the 1950s and 60s and 70s and even in the 1980s, it was like insane amounts of beer was drunk there. With pretty much the decline of this whole heavy industry, also nearly all of the breweries got closed down, got fusion and so on. So nowadays in Dortmund, there's only one huge company left, which is even like owned by a very, very big company. It was crazy that Forman was still able to survive through all this time and just stayed in their kind of like in their league of size where it was comfortable for them and they weren't gambling too much. And all the other ones which were doing very, very successful in the meantime, at some point they lost the game.
But they're not tiny.
It's tiny. For German standards, it's considered tiny. 5,000
Okay.
is tiny. I mean, that's crazy.
A couple of years ago, you also started producing a few of your beers in the United States. What was the thought process behind that?
The focus was to just making beer locally made in the US for having like just way better and fresher qualities and also having a better price point at the same time, you know. So that's like the focus because the whole importation business pretty much collapsed in the US, and so it was not like very interesting. And we had like our major beers were like, you know, like Gose and Unfiltered Courage and so on, and being imported and being in bottles and so on, then just like also with more age wasn't that very desirable. And then we were able to produce the beers right there and get it freshly in cans, which was always also the more favorable container in the US and then also in US kegs. So we have like two new beers which are coming up in a few months. And then, normally we would have had way more planned for this year, but there was this specific crisis, which I think made everybody's life a bit different and harder.
So who's making the beer for you in the US?
It's Urban Chestnut and Upland.
One of the things I enjoy seeing on social media is what I like to call Where in the World is Sebastian Sauer? You've traveled a little bit, probably more than most people. So why don't you tell me a few of the more interesting and obscure places you've been for beer?
I love traveling. I think it's one of the most important things to actually broaden your mind. I mean, it's also definitely tasting a lot of things like drinks and food and so on, but it's also visiting different cultures and just learning. I love learning. And that's like a very, very important part about this, to be open for this. Obscure places, I mean, definitely, which probably has to get mentioned in each of these interviews is my trip to North Korea. I've been to Uganda, I've been to Peru, I've been to Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, Jordan. I was brewing in Jordan with my friend Jazan. So I don't know. There's like a lot of places which were like super cool to visit. Some more about beer, some less about beer, but it's just wonderful to see that no matter where you're going, and even like considering North Korea, how little influence from other countries there is, but you can still see people drinking beer or a beer-like drink everywhere in the world. Doesn't matter if you're in the Andes in Peru and you're actually drinking chicha, which is like fermented through the spit of the people who are like chewing the corn. And through this, you're pretty much breaking up the starches and you're making sugar out of it through the enzymes in the spit. This is like kind of like a basic beer-like drink. North Korea, for example, has a lot of beer drinking people as well. Certain pubs, some workers' pubs, and so on, we visited. In Uganda, I had some banana beer, which was made in this tiny village in the middle of the country. And so there's a lot of like super interesting things to see. But even like from a European view, you don't even need to go that far away. In the east of Europe, for example, we have kvass, which is a rye bread fermented drink. So you pretty much have rye bread, sugar, and water, and then you get a fermentation going through this. So you get a lot of like bready, sweetish character, and depending on how old it is, that it depends on how high the alcohol is. In the Baltic countries and in Scandinavia, you have a lot of like farmhouse ales, which are also very different to what we would consider normally beer. If you imagine beer should be always like pilsner. There's like some wonderful beverages and highly fantastic the way they are produced and the way they taste, and the whole culture and tradition behind it is just like stunning.
Did you have any trips planned that you had to cancel because of the coronavirus?
I mean, I had a lot of general trips planned for this year. I mean, that's like the crazy part that until end of October, early November, I had like a full schedule pretty much. Everything got cancelled until end of August for sure. I would have gone to Mount Athos last month in Greece, which would have been interesting. It's like this autonomic area which is part of Greece. And this is like where since 1000 years they have like a few monasteries, like Orthodox Christian monasteries, and they are autonomic, so they pretty much rule and decide things for their own area. And for example, as a woman, you can't even go there. They only allow male, not only people, but also animals. The only female animals which are allowed to go there are cats. And so that's kind of like as the praising to the dedication to Holy Marie, and so no other woman should pretty much touch that holy ground dedicated
Interesting.
uh, to that. So, and they do their own wines, they do their own agriculture and stuff like this. Normally, I would have probably visited Ethiopia at the end of the month, at the end of the year, and trips to Slovenia, Austria, Croatia, Bulgaria, a lot of places like that, Norway, and so on got cancelled. And so I don't know what the situation will be whenever we can go somewhere else again, traveling to a different continent. But I would definitely try to do a US trip as soon as it is allowed.
Since we backed into it, how has the pandemic been affecting Freigeist?
Everything is pretty much paused right now. I mean, as a gypsy brewery, I obviously don't have this like specific home ground with a physical brewery in this community. So my sales and my things where I focus on is not really in my area, but more like internationally. And so I can't really operate on the base of like doing home deliveries and stuff like this. So this is all not really occurring to me. So I pretty much needed to put everything on pause. Obviously, right now it's just like more focusing on a little bit more administration stuff. But we start to package some stuff soon again, and then I think we can slowly climb up the ladder again.
Good. Is there any way that people can get your beer in the meantime?
Yeah, in the US, my beers are available through Shelton Brothers and through all the distributors which are working with them. Certain other projects, for example, certain beers I'm making in collaboration with Stillwater, they are available through 12% and their distribution. So there's quite a spread where people can actually have some beers where at least had a hand on the recipe. So there's definitely enough around, so it should be easier to find than some places in Germany.
Sebastian, thanks for spending all this time with me today.
Thanks so much for the invitation. It was great talking with you. And thanks to the listeners for your attention. I hope we see each other and maybe you have the chance to enjoy some of my beers. Thank you.
Talk to you soon. If you'd like to learn more about Freigeist, you can visit their Facebook page. The link is in the video's description. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.